Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Envera at the Board. Today we're going to talk about 6 ways to ensure that you have an annual emission report that is not only accurate, but it's also properly submitted. Now, in our experience working with annual emission reports, there are a number of common areas that people overlook, and these areas have the ability to affect the accuracy of the overall report. And so, being that you're in the middle of report preparation now, it's important that you understand what these common areas are so that you don't accidentally end up compromising the accuracy of your own report, or if you're having a consultant prepare your report for you, that your consultant doesn't end up making some of the same mistakes that we've seen in the past. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we get into that, a few specifics related to the 2015 annual emission report. Number one, this year the report is due Tuesday, March 1st, 2016 at 5 o'clock to the AER-exempt. And then in addition to that, the AER-exempt is also having a number of workshops at their facility in Diamond Bar that will go over some of the details and some of the changes related to the 2016 report. And if you're interested in attending those workshops, you can go to the AER-exempt on the days here, actually, on the 12th at 1 p.m., on the 27th at 1 p.m., on the 14th at 9 a.m., or on the 21st at 9 a.m. All of these dates are in January, and if you attend these workshops, they're always well attended. And they do give away a lot of good information about what has changed within the reporting tool. And then they also let you know if there have been any programmatic changes to the report that will be rolled out for this year. Now, some of the changes that we do know, and some of these changes are not changes to the report, but they're updates to current guidance documents, is that we know that the AER-exempt has updated their guidance on organic liquid storage tanks, dairy and poultry operations, as well as polyester resin operations. And so if you have a facility that has a organic liquid storage tank, or you have a facility that is a dairy or poultry operation or a polyester resin operation, then you want to be sure that you check out these guidance documents, because they have been updated, or they were updated in December. And they may have, and the updates may impact your facility. So you want to check these guidance documents out nonetheless. All right, enough with the specifics. Let's get into some of the common areas that get overlooked when people prepare annual emission reports. So number one relates to a facility's ammonia emissions. You know, ammonia emissions are the result of the combustion of fuel. And on the annual emission report, there are several default emission factors that are used to calculate the emissions of ammonia from the combustion of fuel. Now, the problem results is that people don't use the proper ammonia emission factor when calculating the emissions on your annual emission report. More specifically, they end up not using, or they end up using a default emission factor that doesn't describe their equipment correctly. What I mean by that, they end up using a default emission factor for a piece of equipment that has the wrong control device on it. So let's unpack that a little bit. The ammonia emissions, or the default ammonia emissions within the AER, are broken down into 2 groups. You have the internal combustion and you have the external combustion. Within each of these categories, the ammonia emission is further characterized by the type of control device found on each piece of equipment. And so you'll have a default emission factor for an internal combustion engine with an SCR. You'll have an ammonia default emission factor for an internal combustion engine for a piece of equipment that has an SNCR. And then you'll have a default emission factor for an internal combustion engine with no control device. And then likewise, on the external combustion equipment, you'll have the same thing. You'll have the external combustion equipment with SCR, you'll have one with SNCR, and then you'll have one with none. People tend to make the mistake of selecting the wrong default emission factor for their piece of equipment simply because they don't know what kind of control device is attached to their equipment. Now, there's a few ways to know what the control device is. You can look at your permit, you can go out and look at the equipment at hand, but whatever the case, you want to be sure that when you're calculating your ammonia emissions from your either internal or external piece of equipment, that you use the correct default emission factor. And then on top of that, what we find is that the reporting software has several default emission factors for all of these cases that we've talked about here. The default ammonia emission factor in the AER software is typically not what most, it typically describes equipment that most people don't have. And so I think if I remember correctly, I think that the default ammonia emission factor in the reporting tool describes internal combustion equipment with SCR. I think that's what it is, but most engines won't have an SCR on them. And so if you're moving through the reporting tool very fast, then you may select the wrong default ammonia emission factor, and then you may end up overestimating your ammonia emissions. So number one, be sure that you select the correct ammonia emission factor. Number two, actually I'm going to move over here. Number two, you want to be sure that the fuel usages on your annual emission report match the fuel usages that you use to prepare your reclaim reports. Now, Reclaim, again, is a program. It's a regional cap and trade program for NOx and SOx here in the South Coast Air Quality Management District. And if you're in the Reclaim program, you're required to submit annual or quarterly and annual reports of your NOx and or SOx emissions to the AQMD. Those reports are going to be based off of fuel usages, and you need to maintain all the documentation in a folder or in a file to back all of those, to back up all the calculations that you end up submitting. When the problem that we see is that when people prepare annual emission reports for a reclaim facility, they end up taking the fuel usages for the combustion equipment from a different source that is not the same source that was used to prepare the reclaim emissions. And so what happens is that when people do that, the emissions that, or the fuel usage that is calculated on the AER differs from the fuel usage that is used or that was calculated to report their emissions under the reclaim program. And so you want to be sure that the fuel usages that you use for your AER match those that were used to prepare the quarterly reclaim reports. In addition, you want to be sure that you subtract out any AER-exempt sources. So as an example, PERP equipment or equipment that's registered under the California Portable Equipment Registration Program, while those emissions sometimes are reported to under the reclaim program, those emissions are actually exempt under the AER. So you don't want to report the PERP emissions that are in your reclaim reports under the AER because that's an exempt emission source. And so for that case, you want to be sure that you subtract out any PERP equipment that may have emissions on your reclaim report when preparing your annual emission report. So as a general formula, we see that the emissions that you're reporting on your AER should be the sum of all the fuel usages used to prepare your quarterly reports minus any AER exempt equipment. And so again, the fuel usages that you end up using to report your AER emissions should be the fuel usages that you use to report the quarterly emissions minus any AER exempt emission sources. And that's going to require you to go through the reports and look at all the different sources that were reported under the reclaim reports and then figure out which sources are exempt under the AER program. And so that brings us to the third one, is that be sure that you are not reporting any AER exempt emission sources on your report. So, we talked about the portable equipment for the reclaimed fuel usages and how you have to subtract that out when you're going to take that reclaimed fuel usage and use it on your AER, what are some of these other AER-exempt fuel sources or emission sources? You have architectural coatings. Architectural coatings in general do not need to be reported on the AER. Those are actually, as a group, those architectural coatings are an exempt emission source. However, there are certain cases in where you will need to report architectural coatings on your AER, and that case is if the architectural coating is actually part of the production process. But in general, the use of architectural coatings within a facility is generally exempt. That would be one exempt emission source. Any sort of compounds or any sort of emission points that have Rule 102 exempt materials don't need to report it. The most common 102 exempt compound is acetone. So if you have a process that's emitting acetone, that's an AER sort of exempt emission source. Mobile sources, if you have mobile sources, those are not reported on your AER. And then like we said, the portable equipment. If you have portable equipment, you don't need to report those emissions on your AER. And so number 3 is be sure that you don't end up reporting exempt emission sources on your AER. Now number 4 is be sure that if you end up using any source test results on your AER, that the source test was approved for use before you're going to use it on your AER. And so what we commonly see is that people will report their emissions from a piece of combustion equipment, but rather than using the default emission factors for combustion, they'll use a source test report because they want to get a more accurate emission profile from that piece of equipment. That's okay, but you want to be sure that your source test is approved prior to use or approved prior to use on your emission report. So that means that prior to 2016, you will need to have had a source test that went through the entire approval process: protocol, notification, report submittal, report review, receipt of confirmation or approval letter. Only when a source test is approved, you can use that report to calculate emissions on your annual emission report. Unfortunately, if the results are not approved, then you're going to have to revert back to the default emission factor or the source test, or using the source test that was last approved. So number 4 is be sure that your source test results are approved prior to use on your annual emission report. Number 5 is, where possible, be sure that you use facility-specific sampling data. Now, a lot of times when calculating emissions in an annual emission report, people will use default emission factors. And that's fine if you don't have any other data set available to you, but oftentimes environmental compliance programs are fairly complex. They have a lot of different regulations, and within those regulations there will be a lot of reporting and monitoring requirements and so forth. And so what we typically find is that when running or when operating a fairly complicated or fairly complex and large environmental compliance program, you're going to almost always be required to sample or collect samples from your process to fulfill some other reporting requirement. And so some of the cases that we see are collecting material samples for maybe a TRI, collecting wastewater samples for a self-monitoring wastewater report, or collecting samples for hazardous waste profiles to manage hazardous waste. Now, if you have all of these data and you can use them to calculate emissions, then you should use this facility-specific data when calculating emissions on your annual emission report. You can use these data in conjunction with the standard emission calculation techniques and formulas. And one way that we see, or one example of where we see this to be a benefit, is when reporting emissions from cooling towers. Interestingly, reporting emissions from cooling towers using the default emission factors will produce emissions that grossly overestimate the process. And we'll link up a few studies that have actually noted this and have actually tried to derive corrections for this overestimate, but the best thing that you can do is that if you have a cooling tower is simply just collect the data needed to use the facility-specific data within the standard emission calculation formulas. And so that's one specific method, but that's not the only one. Where possible, you may be able to use facility-specific data from other regulatory programs to calculate emissions on your annual emission report. So again, number 5 is simply, where possible, be sure that you use facility-specific data on your annual emission report if you have them. I'm not going to go too much more into that because it can get fairly complex really fast, but just know that. And then number 6, be sure you prepare a complete submission. So what do we mean by that? To submit an annual emission report requires 2 things. Number 1, to do an electronic submission using the reporting tool, and then number 2, to actually follow that electronic submission up with a hard copy submission that you will then submit to the AER-exempt along with wet signatures on the form and a check if your fees are due. So number 6 is be sure that your submission is complete. That means that you've completed the electronic submission, and then you've actually completed the hard copy submission. We've seen all sorts of variations of the submittal of one but not the other. So maybe they'll submit the electronic report but not the hard copy report. Maybe they'll submit the hard copy report but not submit the electronic report. They may submit the electronic report and the hard copy report, and then maybe they'll forget a signature, or maybe they'll forget the forms. Whatever the case, you want to be sure that you get your report submitted complete. It's completely submitted to the AER-exempt by the March 1st deadline. And again, that means that you've done the electronic submission, you've printed out the forms from that electronic submission, you've got those forms signed by a responsible official at your facility, and then if fees are due, you submit the signed forms along with a check to the AER-exempt by the March 1st deadline. Only then do you have a complete submission. And so there you have it, 6 ways to ensure that your annual emission report is not only accurate, but it's submitted properly. Let's run through the list one more time. So number 1, be sure that your ammonia emissions are correct. You're using the right default emission factor, which is dependent on the kind of control equipment installed to that piece of equipment, either external or external combustion device. Number 2, be sure that the fuel usages used on your AER match those that were used to prepare the reclaim reports. Number 3, be sure that you're not reporting or calculating emissions from any exempt or AER-exempt emission sources. We talked about the 4 here: architectural coatings, any emission source that emits 102 exempt compounds, mobile sources, and portable equipment. Number 4, we talked about be sure that when using a source test, that source test is approved prior to use on the annual emission report. Number 5, we talked about using facility-specific data, and we talked that sometimes when it's possible, you should use facility-specific data. You may have, within your annual emission report, you may have to look in other regulatory programs for these data, like a TRI, maybe the wastewater program, the stormwater program, or maybe even hazardous waste profiles. And then number 6, we talked about a complete submission. And a complete submission is one where you actually submit online via the electronic reporting tool. You print the forms out, you sign the forms, you include the check, and then you take that complete package and then you submit it to the AER-exempt. So it's an electronic copy or electronic submission followed up by a hard copy submission. So there you have it. You know, we're trying to just provide you some value so that when you go ahead and prepare your 2016 annual emission report, that you know some of the sort of pitfalls or kind of common areas that people tend to overlook that affect the accuracy. We hope that it sheds some light on some of these sort of problem areas. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us here at Envera Consulting. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video. Take care.